Hello everyone and welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. Today's video is going to be about macromolecules. But before I start talking about macromolecules, I want to talk about the 6 elements that are necessary for life, and they are listed here on the screen. You need to know these 6. So you could probably guess the first 2, hydrogen and oxygen, because as we know, most organisms are made mostly of water. Carbon is bold because it forms the backbone of all of the macromolecules that we are going to talk about later on in a second. Nitrogen is a component in both our DNA as well as our proteins. Phosphorus is a component in our DNA molecules, and then sulfur is sometimes a component in some of the proteins in our bodies. So you do need to know these 6. A way to remember that is to come up with a mnemonic device that is pertinent to you. And if you can't, or if you're not feeling creative and you want to use mine, that's great. So you all know that I like to play video games. I have a PlayStation. So the way that the mnemonic device that I came up with is can't hop on PlayStation now, because when you're in school you can't play it, so that's a bummer. So I came up with that to help me remember the 6 elements that are necessary for life. So carbon, as I mentioned, forms the backbone of all of the macromolecules that we are going to talk about today. So let's review real quick. All right, so we know that carbon's atomic number is 6, and we talked about how those electrons are going to be arranged. So remember, in the first level we have our 2 electrons. Carbon has 2 electrons in the first level, and then the second level, carbon has only 4 electrons. And remember the octet rule, it wants to be full, so it wants to achieve, or wants to gain 4 more electrons in that outer shell there. So in order to do that, carbon has the ability to form 4 covalent bonds. It creates these very unique shapes that we see, and we're going to explore that in this unit. You'll see it in lab and things like that. So carbon has the ability to form 4 different covalent bonds, and it also has the ability to bond with itself and create these long chains of macromolecules that we see, also these unique shapes, and we're going to explore those in this unit. So the 4 macromolecules that we're going to talk about are what we call organic compounds. So you need to know that an organic compound is any molecule that contains carbon. If you take organic chemistry in college, you'll be studying all about carbon molecules. So again, organic compounds contain carbon. So we're going to be talking about macromolecules today. So macromolecules, what is it? Macro means big. So macromolecules are these very large molecules that are found in our body, and they consist of smaller pieces, which we call monomers. So think of a monomer as a Lego. All right, so you have your one little Lego, and you start adding Legos to it, and you create these larger structures. Those would be our macromolecules, that are also called polymers because there are many of these monomers put together. And the process that creates these monomers, or creates, not these monomers, but creates these macromolecules, is called polymerization. All right, it's a process that basically connects all of these monomers to make these very large molecules, and we're going to talk about how and the specifics of that later when we get into lab and things like that. So the 4 organic macromolecules that we are going to talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. These are basically the 4 categories that we are going to talk about. So carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are have this basic formula that you see here on the screen, CH2O. And one of the things that you're going to have to be able to do, because it is a favorite SOL question, is to be able to discuss the function of a carbohydrate, as well as to be able to identify a carbohydrate either by the chemical formula they give you, or the structures. You see some of the structures here on the screen, or by basically the name of the carbohydrate. So ways that you can identify a carbohydrate. Let's start with that. So notice the basic formula is is CH2O. And what that means is that there are 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 carbon and every 1 oxygen. So if you see the ratio being such that there are 2 hydrogens for every carbon and every oxygen, then that tells you it is a carbohydrate. Glucose, if you look here on the screen, notice that there are 2 hydrogens for every carbons. All right, there are 12 hydrogens and there are 6 carbons, so it meets the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The monomer for a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Mono means 1. All right, so there are 1 sugars that are going to be linked together to form the much larger structures that we see in our bodies. So if there are 2 monosaccharides connected together, we call that a disaccharide. If there are 3 connected together, we call that a trisaccharide. And if there are 4 or more connected together, we call that a polysaccharide. So you need to know the functions of them. So the main function of a carbohydrate is that it is our main energy source. All right, our body is going to break down the sugars that we eat, all right, in order to form an energy molecule that we're going to talk about later, ATP, and that's what's going to provide us with the energy that we need to do a lot of the processes that go on in our body. The second function of a carbohydrate is in structure. So we know that plants have cell walls, and cell walls are made of cellulose. Cellulose is a very strong polysaccharide that helps basically plants be able to stand upright. They don't have a backbone like us, so the cellulose that's there helps them basically stand upright without the formation of a backbone. And then the other type of structural component, it would be chitin. Chitin is also a polysaccharide, and that is the hard, basically hard structure that you see in the exoskeleton of insects. So structural component, short-term energy, our main source of energy. And then the third function that we're going to talk about is acts as an ID tag, and we're going to talk about that a lot when we get into the cell membrane, because on the surface of your cell membrane is this carbohydrate chain, and what that does is it acts as an ID tag. It tells your body that, hey, this cell belongs to this person, and the function of this cell is to do this. All right, so what happens is if you've ever gotten sick, you got exposed to a bacteria. Bacteria enters your body, and it basically sends off these alarms to your body because it does not have your ID tag attached to it. So it knows it's a foreign particle, so it starts basically an immune response. And they also help with basically, they act as a receptor for other medicines and things like that to attach to the cell membrane. So back to how can I identify that, because you will be expected to identify something as a carbohydrate. Again, remember the ratio 1 to 2 to 1, and then the other thing is by the ending that you see here down here at the bottom. So typically sugars end in the ending OSE. If you see that, that tells you it is a sugar. Not all of them, sorry about that, do not end in OSE. Starch, glycogen, those are both carbohydrates. They are complex sugars, but they do not end in that OSE ending, but the majority of them do have that ending. So if you see that, that tells you it's a sugar. And the third way is to look at basically the components that are there and also the unique structures. So carbohydrates have these unique shapes. If you see these unique shapes and you do not see any other element around them, so if you look at the ones that are here, you do not see nitrogen present and you do not see phosphorus present. So because I don't see those two, I know that this is a carbohydrate. And these are what we call hexose sugars because it forms that hexagon shape. And when we get into DNA, we're going to talk about ribose and deoxyribose. Those are what we call pentose sugars because it has the pentagon shape. So if you see these unique shapes, but you do not see nitrogen and phosphorus present, it tells you it is a carbohydrate. All right, so that brings us to lipids. Lipids, if you notice, also consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids are probably the easiest macromolecule to identify because you see they form these long chains of carbons. All right, and there are two types of lipids that you need to know: saturated and unsaturated. So unsaturated means is that you see this little guy right here. All right, it has one or more double bonds present. And when it forms that double bond, it removes basically hydrogens in order to form that. So that's why it's called unsaturated. It doesn't have as many hydrogens as it can possibly have around those carbons because of the double bond there. Notice saturated. All right, there's as many hydrogens as it can get around those carbons, and it lacks the double bond, so it's called a saturated fat or a saturated lipid. So you need to know the two types of lipids. And you need to know the monomer for a lipid is a fatty acid. So lipids consist of two parts basically. You have the fatty acids, which is these long chains that you see right here, and the glycerol group, all right, this guy right here. All right, but for us, just know the monomer is a fatty acid. So what are the functions of a lipid? There are lots of functions of lipids. One of the main ones is it is our long-term energy source. So if we eat too many carbohydrates, you know that your body is going to store that as fat. It stores it as fat so that it has a source of energy in the event that we don't eat enough one day. So our body can basically tap into those fat deposits, releasing the energy that is stored there for us in order to do the processes that we need. Forming membranes. Lipids is a major component of your cell membranes in your body, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next unit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of detail here. Just know that it is a major component in your membranes. Third is waterproof covering. So if you see the waxy covering on a plant leaf, it is there to help prevent water loss. So a lot of your organs and things like that are going to be coated to help prevent or have a waterproof covering. And then the last thing is insulation. So polar bears, whales, they have this very thick layer of blubber that is going to help keep them warm in those very cold environments that they live in. So an example of a lipid would be fats, oils, and waxes. Nucleic acids. Nucleic acids is probably the easiest one of the four macromolecules that we're going to talk about. One, because it only has one main function, and that is to store and transmit hereditary or genetic information. All right, so part of your mom and dad's DNA was passed on to you. Every time your cells replicate, it's passing on your DNA to those new cells that are created. So it's storing that information and then transmitting it later as needed. Two examples of macromolecules for nucleic acids would be ribonucleic acid, which is RNA, and then deoxyribonucleic acid, which is your DNA molecules. So DNA is, or nucleic acids are easy to spot because they are going to have nitrogen and phosphorus. As soon as I see phosphorus and nitrogen together, then I know that it is a nucleic acid. So again, pretty easy one for you to know. All right, the last one that we're going to talk about is protein. Protein, notice, has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So proteins are easy to spot because of the presence of the amino group. All right, that's why we call them the monomer amino acids. All right, if I see NH2 in my structural component and I do not see phosphorus present, then I know that I'm looking at a protein. Or if I see sulfur present, I know I'm looking at a protein if I see it along with this NH2 group. All right, because the monomer for a protein is an amino acid. All right, there are a lot of functions associated with proteins, and we're going to go into some of those here. We're going to talk a lot about them in upcoming units as well. So the first function of a protein, we already talked about enzymes briefly, is that it controls the rate of reactions. Remember, enzymes speed up chemical reactions by lowering activation energy. Enzymes are necessary for us to help with the processes that occur in our body. Without them, they would take a long time to occur, and those harmful substances would build up in our body and could potentially kill us. But our body uses enzymes to help speed those processes up so that we can live long and healthy lives. The second is that it regulates cell processes. So when you eat, all right, your body is going to start to produce those enzymes. Amylase, salivary amylase. As soon as you put food in your mouth, Amylase is going to start to break down the food that's there. Hormones, again, when you eat, insulin is going to be there to help regulate your blood sugar. It is a major component, obviously, of your bones, muscles, and other structures. Transport substances into and out of cells. All right, so we talk about cell membrane, you'll see that protein is a major part of the cell membrane, and the protein is what's going to allow large particles and particles that have a charge in order to move through the cell membrane. So we're gonna talk about that a lot in the next coming unit. So just know that helps transport substances in and out of the cells right now. It's going to help fight disease. And remember when we talked about carbohydrates, carbohydrates acts as an ID tag. It tells basically your body that these cells belong, what their job is, and as soon as it gets a foreign invader, let's say a bacteria or pollen, all right, it's going to trigger an immune response. So as soon as you come in contact with pollen, if you are allergic to it, your body is going to start producing histamine, and that helps basically localize that invader to that area so that your body can now start to basically attack it and fight it. And then component of cell membranes, again, like I said, major component of it, which is what's going to help move substances in and out of the cell, and then help with immunity. So if you've been sick before, your body has produced antibodies to fight that illness, and it's going to store that information so that if you get sick again, your body can then produce those antibodies and fight that illness much faster. So how can I identify proteins? I already talked about looking for the presence of the NH2 group, the amine group. So the other way that you can identify an enzyme is by the ending ASE. So you see it here, ASE. So a lot of enzymes are named so that it indicates the substrate that it works on and has that ASE ending. So the enzyme that I have on the board, or on the screen, sorry, is lactase. So lactase is going to break apart lactose. All right, and then in the last video you heard me talk about catalase. So if it has that ending ASE, it is an enzyme. Not all of them are going to have that ending, but a good portion of them do. So how can I identify them? Look for the presence of the amino group, the NH2 that you see there, and no phosphorus, that tells me it's a protein. Or if I see sulfur there, that tells me it's a protein and I see the NH2 there with it. Or look at the name of the molecule. So if I see ASE, that tells me that it is a protein. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because we are going to spend a lot of time, especially with enzymes and cell transport, in the next unit.